The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 9, Beginnings of a Cover-Up, Segment 1, The Ghost.
Welcome to Chapter 9, The Beginnings of a Cover-Up. This segment, Segment 1, is The Ghost. When Kennedy died, we know for a fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, one of our prime suspects, was in the vicinity of where Kennedy was shot, the Texas School Book Depository, at the time. We also know that one of our other prime suspects, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was actually in the motorcade in the vicinity of where Kennedy was shot at the time of Kennedy's death. What we do not know is where our third major prime suspect was at the time that Kennedy died, and that was the mob. One of the reasons we cannot be sure of who, if anyone, of the mob was in the area of Kennedy's death is because right after Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, Texas officials closed the case. No more investigation at all. No investigation into anything. And of course, we know that Lyndon Johnson with the Warren Commission centered upon only one suspect, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. So they didn't do any investigation into Johnson, who we know was there, or into the mob who may have been there. So it's very difficult to prove with 100% certainty that the mob was there using and looking at things 6 years later. But there is enough tangential evidence to prove that the mob was not a ghost, but they were in fact heavily involved in this assassination. There are several ways to take the mob from ghost status to actual known participant in the Kennedy assassination. The first is, let's look at what one mobster who was around in 1963 had to say about the Kennedy assassination, and that's Bill Bonanno, whose crime family ran parts of New York. And Bonanno, if you recall, was one of the crime family members who met in 1960 before the Democratic National Convention to have a mob mini convention. And Bonanno and another guy were the two guys sent to visit Joe Kennedy and to tell them what the mob had decided. And that was Kennedy would be the president and LBJ would be his backup man. Bonanno said the following.
And there was a lot of uneasiness in our world. And some of the people that we had more or less arm twisted to support him said, see, we told you we were going to get double-crossed. So we arranged to have a meeting with Joe Kennedy, and Joe said that the boys will be home for Christmas, and I'll talk to them about it. Unfortunately, Joe Kennedy got a stroke in that fateful December, and that cut the umbilical cord to the administration, to Washington, from people in our world. From there on, it all went downhill.
In December of 1961, when Bobby Kennedy was starting to go rogue on the mob, they had a meeting set up with Joe Kennedy to discuss the Kennedys keeping their word and Bobby Kennedy backing off. Unfortunately, as Bonanno stated, Kennedy had a stroke, and that's when things got out of hand. Bonanno also stated the following.
I've detailed in one of the chapters in the book of how I came into this information as to what was happening, what had happened in Dallas on that day. And I was in the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in San Pedro, California, and we were sitting around the yard with a bunch of fellows, some Cubans, and a fellow by the name of Johnny Roselli. And Johnny Roselli, this was in January, February of 1971. And Johnny was very upset with some of the people in his organization back in Chicago, and was saying things that he shouldn't have been saying. Among them was, you know, those guys left me out to dry. I was in the manhole. It took me 20 minutes to walk the labyrinth underneath, the tunnels underneath, to get to the Trinity River. It was my shot that got Jack, and they left me hanging out to dry. I'll never forgive them. But I've been asked many times, do you believe that to be true? And I said, of course I believe it to be true. And they asked me why I believed it to be true, because I knew who I was talking with. Here we're talking to a guy by the name of Johnny Roselli, who was involved in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He was one of the shooters in that. Why wouldn't I believe a man who has that kind of a background? Plus, we knew each other from the streets. So I don't know if that answers your question. When you say mechanics, there is no doubt in my mind that the assassination of the president, unfortunately, came about because of a weakness at that point in the history of our people.
Those were the words of a known mobster from a mobster family that was in power in 1963. And that was that the mob was involved in the killing of John F. Kennedy. The reason they wanted to kill Kennedy is because the president's brother was carrying out an unrelenting attack on the mob, destroying it. They were unable to talk with Joe Kennedy any further because of his stroke, although they had a meeting scheduled with Kennedy in December of 1961, and attempts to intimidate the president by issuing and sending out scandalous material to the press were not working. The killing of Kennedy could not hinge on just one plan, one attempt. And that is because the mob's backup man to Kennedy was going down in a flame of scandals. The killing had to be done within weeks or months, or the mob would be completely destroyed. In fact, it has now been revealed that there were absolutely known plans to kill Kennedy in at least 3 cities prior to Dallas. Former Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden, just 20 days before Kennedy's murder, discovered plans to have Kennedy killed in Chicago when he was attending the Army football game on November 2nd, 1963. The president was scheduled to be in mobster Sam Giancana's hometown. Kennedy was not only going to attend the game, but he was planning on traveling in a motorcade from O'Hare Airport to downtown Chicago. However, just before the trip, the Secret Service received credible evidence from the FBI that a 4-man hit squad was trying to assassinate the president from a building using high-powered rifles with telescopic sights. Sources have also said that beyond Chicago, Illinois, there would be attempts on Kennedy in both Tampa and Miami, 2 other cities that Kennedy would be traveling to before Dallas. On November 18, 1963, Kennedy was to travel to Tampa, Florida, and give a speech at the L. Lopez Stadium. He was supposed to be shot by another hit squad, this time by Santos Trafficante in his stronghold town. After that, Kennedy was to fly to Miami, which he did, on the very same Tampa trip. And there has already been public concession that there was a threat against Kennedy in Miami. The Miami police received a tip that there was a plot to assassinate the president involving a sniper from a high-rise building. The Miami police found and detained a man with a high-powered weapon staying in a high-rise hotel along the Miami motorcade route. If one chooses to go further, there is a man that has come forth in the last 30 years by the name of Jimmy or James Files, and has stated that he was involved in the Kennedy assassination on orders from Sam Giancana. The other people who Jimmy Files named as being involved in the mob hit on Jack Kennedy, the primary known ones are 2 mob hitmen. One was named Chuck Nicoletti, or Charles Nicoletti. The other was Johnny Roselli. Both were mob hitmen. Sam Giancana as the leader. All 3 of these men were murdered mob style just before they were scheduled to testify to various government commissions. Sam Giancana was found murdered in his home, shot once in the back of his head with a .22 and 6 other shots around his mouth. Johnny Rosselli, an associate of Sam Giancana and an enforcer for the Chicago crime family, was found murdered. He had apparently been shot in the belly and then strangled and then stuffed into a barrel and dumped in the bay in Key Biscayne, Florida. Lastly, mob enforcer Chuck Nicoletti, the man with at least 22 kills on behalf of the outfit, the Chicago crime family, was murdered in his own car in March of 1977, shot 3 times in the back of his head just before he was to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations and talk about the Kennedy killing. Now, all of this is circumstantial evidence, but we can go one step further with the mob, and that is the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Lee Harvey Oswald on live television before millions of viewers, according to Bill Bonanno, a top crime figure, Jack Ruby was an associate of Sam Giancana out of Chicago. Can you imagine that the people who were named as the mob's hit squad, all before they were supposed to testify, before various government commissions, ended up dead? Every one of them except Chuck Nicoletti's driver, Jimmy Files, who we will talk about in more detail in our next segment. See you soon.